Hey everyone, and thanks for joining me for another episode in Let's Build a Band App. So in this series, we are working through building an application to support the needs of DIY bands. We'll start out solving some basic problems and move into more complex ground, eventually transforming the application into a platform that others can use and build upon. Accompanying the series is a corresponding workshop as well as a code repository. And in that code repository, you can find a commit diff that will show you the difference between the code that we will generate in this episode compared to the code in the previous episode. So in the previous episode, we installed our prerequisites and we got an understanding of what LoopBack provides and initialized our LoopBack application. And in this episode, we're going to build out our first API endpoint. So LoopBack takes a model-driven approach to building out APIs, and based on our responses to command line prompts, LoopBack will create a JSON file with our model schema and endpoint details. For an introduction to LoopBack models, you can go to the LoopBack documentation and type in models in the search field, and you'll be taken to a page that will explain it a little bit further and allow you to go deeper. So let's get right into it. To invoke the generator, we type lb model, and the generator will go through a list of prompts that will ask us questions about our model. Now, the first question that it asks us is, what is the name of our model? I'm going to call it event. You'll notice it's not events. It's singular when building out our model. And the application handles plurals pretty naturally, as we'll see in an upcoming step. The next question is the data source to attach our event model to. LoopBack generalizes backend services such as databases, REST APIs, SOAP web services, and storage services as data sources. And then it uses what it calls connectors to enable LoopBack applications to use a given data source. Again, you can look at the documentation and search for connectors to read more about that. LoopBack has many data sources available to it, and there is a whole list here of, let me go to the conventional ones here. So these are the officially supported database connectors. You can see that's a pretty good list that IBM and StrongLoop support directly. And then, as you saw a second ago, we have a list of community connectors as well. And the connector logic was built so that it would enable other developers to create their own data source connectors or be able to easily contribute to existing ones. So as you can see, there are a number of options already covered for us here. I am going to choose the in-memory data store here, as I have no other data sources connected to my application. But in a later episode, we will go through connecting a data source. It's actually quite easy, and the command line walks you through this step as well. One thing to note is that in using the in-memory data source, every time we shut down our application, we will lose all our data. So maybe later on in this episode or in an upcoming episode, we'll look at persisting our in-memory data to a file. And then, as I mentioned in an upcoming step, upcoming episode, we'll add a conventional data source as well. So using the in-memory data store is great for prototyping and things like that. We're just going to choose that for now. The next question is for us to choose our model's base class. And you can see there are a number of options in here. A really powerful one is the user base class. You might extend this for members of your application, whatever sort of user role you may have. And as you can see, LoopBack has a number of base classes built in that you can extend. We're going to choose the persisted model for our model class. It's the one that you'll typically choose, and it keeps your data in sync between your application and your data store. The next question is whether we want to expose our endpoint via the public REST API. Of course we do. It makes sense in this case, but there may be reasons why you may want to have a private endpoint as you further build out your application. As I mentioned earlier, LoopBack handles plurals very well. It'll handle child to children, mouse to mice, these kinds of things. Of course, event to events is very simple. If you had something like attorneys general, that may be a case that you might need to put in a custom plural, but usually you don't need to. And the next question is whether we want to use a common model or a server-only model. We can choose to only have this model available to the server, or we can make it available to the client as well. In an effort to be forward-thinking, I'll choose the common model, but in case we want to use any of the client SDKs or any other client options in the future. But if you know you don't need that, then you can just choose the servers. And now the generator is asking us about details specific about our model. So it starts off with the first property that we want to attach to the model. So the first thing that we'll have here is venue, the venue property. And we will choose string, but as you can see, there are a number of options here, and we'll we'll hit a couple of those as we have a lot of properties to add to this model. And it asks us if we want it required or not. I'm going to say that it is required. And we'll leave the value blank for default, but you could have TBD if you wanted some sort of value in there. It's up to you. Now I have a number of properties that I want to add here, and so I'm going to kind of cruise through those pretty quickly, but you'll see that it's rather easy to input these properties very quickly. All of these upcoming properties are not required, and I will not have a default value, so this will allow me to kind of plow through these pretty quickly. So the next property I'm going to add is the date, which is going to be a date type. And again, it's not required and no default value. We'll also add cost, which is a number. We'll also add lineup, and this one is interesting because this is an array, and then it asks us what type of items do we expect to have in the array, and it will be an array of strings. So we'll move on to location, which is also a string. We'll say poster for the poster that will be for the flyer for the event, and that is also a string. We'll say URL, string as well, city, state, and description. And last one is age restriction. All ages, 21 and over, that kind of thing. And now you'll notice here that it says enter an empty object, an empty property name when you're finished. So we'll do that now. And we'll take a moment to look at the files that are generated from the command line. So we'll open up our editor here, and you'll notice a directory here called common, which has a directory called models. And this is our event.json file here. A couple of things from the beginning, our base class, and then these are the properties that we just entered in. And you'll notice that we have a required property here. These are all of our types. And then in this one, we have a type, which is the array type. And in that array is it expects there to be strings. So as you can see here, our properties are all listed out. And then we also have a number of key value pairs here for validations, relations, ACLs, and remote methods. And we'll get into those later on, but you'll notice them from the JSON file that is outputted. And one of the things that I love about LoopBack is that not only is the command line generator very easy and quick to use, but the generated model definition file, this JSON file, is also very easy to understand. It's very accessible. There's nothing in here that really kind of makes me nervous to go in there and edit. So for example, if I wanted to make the date required, I just do that. I add that in there and I'm good to go. So it's a very accessible configuration file, I believe. And then also, along with the JSON file, we have this JS file that is outputted for us. And this is where we will add application logic to the flow of our model, or connecting to data sources or anything like that. There are three ways to add custom application logic to our models. There's remote methods, there are remote hooks, and there are operation hooks. For the sake of this workshop, we'll simply look at adding a simple remote method, but if we need other ways to add application logic, the approach is very similar, and we can get the details from the documentation. So I'm actually going to jump over to the workshop here so that we can look at some examples of remote methods. So this one here I have pulled directly out of the LoopBack documentation, and in this example we're building out a coffee shop review app, and as you can see here, we this code would look like this in our application. So it would look like that essentially, right? What's going on here is the coffee shop object is passed in. We attach the status method to that coffee shop object and pass in the callback function. And we set up our date, and we get the current hours. And we basically say if it is later than 6 a.m. or before 8 p.m., we are open for business. Otherwise, we are closed. And then we call our callback, and we basically use this remote method to attach the status remote method to our coffee shop model, and some details along with that. So that's a very rudimentary example that you may use to attach a status endpoint on your model. Another example here is before you create your model, you may want to do some logic. And in this one, if you can imagine a form that a user may interact with and they submit it, but before you push that data up, you may want to attach a timestamp. And you may also want to attach the user ID to that instance of your data. And so these are a couple of examples of how you may use this JS file that corresponds to your model to add additional application logic. Hey, so I was just showing this video to my colleague Justin, and he suggested that I show you that remote method and we can see it in action. So if you'll come along with me, I will show it to you. Cool. Here is the event.js file that I was showing you earlier. And it's empty here. This function body is empty, but I'm going to take this coffee shop status remote method, and I'm going to drop it in there, right? We'll put that in there, and then anytime I see coffee shop, I will change that word to event, and that should be good. And now if we go and start our application, and we go over and check that status, boom, it is between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. I think is what the code says, right? Yep, between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. we are open for business. So that is a simple example of adding a remote method. We have our function body here. We attach it to our event model here. And once we run our Node app, it works. At this point, we now have our first API endpoint, and we've gotten some understanding about what code LoopBack has generated and how we can extend functionality based on our model. We can start up our Node app by typing node period in our terminal, and from there we can make requests to the endpoint either in the browser with a simple form or some AJAX, or perhaps through a tool like Postman or using curl directly. And if you run node period in your terminal, it will output two URLs, one to your application and one that will take you directly to your API Explorer. And in the next episode, we'll dive deeper into interacting with our API. We'll use the Swagger Explorer that we get for free with LoopBack to make some requests to our endpoints and see different ways that we can interact with our API and how we can start to build out applications making use of our new API. So thank you very much for tuning in to the series. Let's Build a Band App. I'll see you next episode. Cheers.